B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, September 11th, 2020. 19 years after the incidents at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the plane that crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the 9/11 cover-up is holding firm. And as I plan to retire at the end of this year, this may be my final major statement about September 11th, 2001. I reserve the right to provide additional coverage. I may do occasional podcasts after I retire. But it has been a hard slog. It was in 2004 that a pilot I know, named Dr. Michael Dietrich, said, "Do you have any questions about the official narrative of 9/11? And I said, well, not really. I never really had an opportunity to delve into it. So he was the first to alert me. Then I went to Washington in 2005, did a series of live radio broadcasts from there, and it was Kyle Hentz, who's been a longtime advocate for the Jersey girls, the families of those who were lost at the World Trade Center on September 11th of 2001. And he handed me a copy of David Ray Griffin's first book, A New Pearl Harbor. And, interestingly, we also shared a copy that same evening with Nancy Pelosi, who was not yet the Speaker of the House. And she politely took it and has never mentioned it again. But it was during that same visit to Washington that I spent a week watching the proceedings of the 9/11 Commission, the Kane-Hamilton Commission. And I watched in horror, with building outrage. And when I was in that hearing room, when Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense on 9/11, dodged a question about whether he had scrambled jets to protect the Pentagon after months before they had changed the protocols so that he was the only person in the military or executive branch structure who could order a strike of that sort, a reaction of that sort. And Kane allowed him to run out the clock and gavelled, said, "Next question." And that was the most obvious sign of the cover-up that I describe in my position about 9/11. Now, I am aligned with the 9/11 Truth movement, and I have no shame or embarrassment about that. I've been called a tinfoil hat conspiracy crackpot. But it was a conspiracy on 9/11, and it's David Ray Griffin who has said repeatedly, we're trying to find out what the real conspiracy was and who the real conspirators were. And because the 9/11 movement is not a centralized, controlled, or top-down structure, there are many people who challenge the official narrative and then go beyond that and suggest counter-narratives. And if you've listened to me over the years, you know that I don't do that because I don't have enough evidence to support any alternate narratives. All I know is that the Twin Towers could not have imploded in the manner they did without some accelerant or acceleration. I know that Building 7 did not come down just because of some minor fires that occurred in the building that day. No steel and concrete glass structure has ever crumbled in its own footprint in less than 10 seconds without it being demolished. And likewise, to this day, based on my own observation and a well-placed source who was monitoring the most top-secret communication channel on the morning of 9/11 and heard Dick Cheney give the order to shoot down Flight 93. Of course, none of what I've just said is reflected in the official 9/11 report. When you look at the wrangling over that, how George W. Bush first tried to put Henry Kissinger in charge of that investigation. And you may recall that I've conducted several interviews with former Senator Bob Graham of Florida, who chaired the first joint congressional inquest into the events of 9/11 and continued to fight for publication of the 28 pages that we now know showed the role of Saudi Arabia in the events of 9/11. And I have to single out Richard Gage, the dedicated activist investigator, the architect who set up Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and he's a just the facts guy. And he has shown in PowerPoint presentations, in documentaries that have been produced, and his focus is narrowed to the World Trade Center. But he offers compelling contradictory evidence of the official story. And so here we are in 2020, 19 years on. There has been some progress. There was a recent study by the University of Alaska related to Building 7. There has been action before a grand jury convened after the legal work of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry. But they haven't yielded the break that we've been looking for. And we haven't found the credible whistleblowers who can support Professor Stephen Jones' science-based assertions that there were particles of nanothermite that were discovered in various locations in the debris of the Twin Towers. That was nanothermite, excuse me, I mispronounced that. And so it leaves us with a legacy based on what I consider to be largely a myth. Now, let me be clear. I do not contest that almost 3,000 Americans perished on September 11th. I don't know for a fact that it was an inside job. But I don't believe that it was simply an operation of Al-Qaeda and that the planes were flown into the buildings and the buildings just collapsed. And as I prepare to saddle up on Trigger and have some happy trails of my own, this is the most difficult bit of unfinished business in my own particular world. And I feel for the families who lost a husband or a father or a loved one in those events on September 11th, and who live with the doubts, the skepticism, the inability to trust the government. They feel it most strongly, and while I did not incur that kind of a loss, I'd say I feel it almost as strongly. And so today, Washington Post columnist Michael Rosenwald, in a column that was widely syndicated, I picked it up from the Seattle Times, he recounts the heroism of one Vice President Dick Cheney on the morning of 9/11, how he was hustled by his Secret Service agents who almost picked him up physically and took him to the bunker under the White House. George W. Bush had been reading My Pet Goat to a kindergarten class in Florida, and they sent him on a trip around the country and left Dick Cheney in charge at the White House. And Rosenwald recounts that sequence, quoting Cheney's book as if that's an accurate source. And one of the key points is he quotes Cheney in the autobiography, quote, "At about 10:15, a uniformed military aide came into the room to tell me that a plane believed hijacked was 80 miles out and headed for Washington, D.C." Well, just right there, Cheney shifts the timeline to 10:15. But the eyewitnesses in the room, including Norman Mineta, who I knew as a congressman from San Jose, a man who I think is credible. He was the token Democrat in the Bush cabinet who was Secretary of Transportation. And he asserts that the actual time was about 10:03, which was, well, that was about the time that Flight 93 crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And so, citing Cheney, the Rosenwald piece talks about the heroism of the passengers on Flight 93 and how they used a beverage cart to penetrate the door of the cockpit. And that story may be true. But I firmly believe that Cheney's order was carried out and that Flight 93 was shot down. And why they chose not to share that with the American people, maybe they thought it would unravel other threads of their cover-up, is something I'm still asking about today. And what is the cost of this? What are the self-inflicted wounds? Well, shortly we will get to the report that finally, 19 years after the events of 9/11 and the subsequent fast invasion of Afghanistan that continues to this day, that's one of the self-inflicted wounds. Then, of course, there was the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I have in my hands here a lengthy list created by John Whitehead. And I don't agree with Whitehead on everything. He was one of the activists who led the charge in the Paula Jones case to try to impeach Bill Clinton. And it led to Clinton's lies, which made him vulnerable to impeachment, but I never thought he should have been removed for that. And Whitehead has been a frequent climate denier through the Rutherford Institute. And today he is one of those people who's he's a libertarian, so I'm not going to try to align him with Trump, but he is a skeptic of the coronavirus pandemic. That said, it doesn't blind him to the truth, and it doesn't blind me to his assembly of what we have lost. Free speech, the right to protest, the right to challenge government wrongdoing, due process, a presumption of innocence, the right to self-defense, accountability and transparency in government, privacy, the press, sovereignty, bodily integrity, representative government. He says all these and more have become casualties in the government's ongoing war on the American people, who have been treated like enemy combatants, to be spied on, tracked, scanned, frisked, searched, subjected to all manner of intrusions, intimidated, invaded, raided, manhandled, censored, silenced, shot at, locked up, denied due process, and killed. He writes, in allowing ourselves to be distracted by terror drills, foreign wars, color-coded warnings, partisan politics, and other carefully constructed exercises in propaganda, sleight of hand, and obfuscation, we fail to recognize that the U.S. government has become the enemy of the people. Indeed, the U.S. government has grown so corrupt, greedy, power-hungry, and tyrannical over the course of the past, well, he says 240 plus, but I'll take 19 years, that our constitutional republic has given way to an idiocracy, and representative government has given way to a kleptocracy. And he goes through the Bill of Rights selectively. He talks about the losses under the First Amendment. Increasingly, Americans are being arrested and charged with bogus contempt of cop charges, such as disrupting the peace or resisting arrest, for daring to film police officers engaged in harassment or abusive practices. Journalists are being prosecuted for reporting on whistleblowers. States are passing legislation to muzzle reporting on cruel and abusive corporate practices. And he appears to be more of a Second Amendment supporter than I am. I don't agree with the Supreme Court decision about the Second Amendment conferring an individual right to bear arms. But he does. And he says Americans remain powerless to defend themselves against SWAT team raids and government agents armed to the teeth with military weapons better suited to the battlefield. The Third Amendment reinforces the principle that civilian elected officials are superior to the military by prohibiting the military from entering any citizen's home without consent of the owner. Whitehead argues with the police increasingly training like the military, acting like the military, and posing as military forces, complete with heavily armed SWAT teams, military weapons, assault vehicles, etc. It is clear that we now have what the founders feared most, a standing army on American soil. And Trump multiplied that with his deployment of his goon squads across America this summer. And then the one I feel most passionately about, the Fourth Amendment. He says, unfortunately, the Fourth has suffered the greatest damage in recent years, has been all but eviscerated by an unwarranted expansion of police powers, including strip searches, even anal and vaginal searches of citizens, surveillance, corporate and otherwise, and intrusions justified in the name of fighting terrorism, as well as the outsourcing of otherwise illegal activities to private contractors. So, moving ahead to a little bit later in his article, I've linked to this. It's at Mint Press News. You'll find the link in the show file of today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. But let me breeze through this list here. This is a government in conjunction with its corporate partners that views the citizenry as consumers and bits of data to be bought, sold, and traded. It's a government that spies on and treats its citizens if they have no right to privacy, even in their own homes. A government that is laying the groundwork to weaponize the public's biomedical data as a convenient means by which to penalize certain unacceptable social behaviors. A government that subjects its people to scans, searches, pat-downs, and other indignities by the TSA and raids on so-called soft targets like shopping malls and bus depots by black-clad Darth Vader lookalikes. This is a government that uses fusion centers, which represent the combined surveillance efforts of federal, state, and local law enforcement, to track the citizenry's movements, record their conversations, and catalog their transactions. And one more, this is a government whose wall-to-wall surveillance has given rise to a suspect society in which the burden of proof has been reversed, such that Americans are now assumed guilty until or unless they can prove their innocence. Now, you may not agree with every one of those items that I just enumerated, but the damage has been severe, measurable, and pretty extreme, in my opinion. And the new normal that we see 19 years later after 9/11 shows an increasing power grab by the government and the executive branch in particular. And we look back and see that Bush was bad. Obama, he had a very good veneer. But he normalized domestic surveillance. He expanded drone strikes and the unilateral killing, assassination, if you will, of foreign targets who may or may not have been a direct threat to the United States. And there's so many other standards that have shifted. And the willingness of the American public to accept all this passively. When we see in other countries, and this is why I gave a little extra coverage to Belarus in the past month or so. Because Americans are so pacified. They got their flat-screen TV. They got their restoration hardware, huge couch that they curl up on every night. And yes, they are anesthetized in so many ways. They watch pageants on TV where they care more about who won the rigged voting on American Idol than they do about who was installed after rigged voting, whether it was 2016, 2004, or 2000. So there's no way to be upbeat about 9/11, about the efforts to blow away the myth and the cover-up. This is a sad, sad legacy that we live with. And so if there is anything upbeat, it's that finally, after a couple of years of the U.S. holding bilateral meetings with the Taliban and excluding the Kabul government, or the excuse for a government in Afghanistan, on Saturday in Doha, Qatar, the first direct talks between the Taliban and the current Afghan government are set to begin. This was enabled by the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners held by the government. And I do think that Trump has a sincere goal to bring all American troops out of Afghanistan. And that requires closing those bases that we've invested so much in. And the beachhead that many national security people believe is so important and so essential. 19 years, that's the longest military action, I believe, in American history. And it's about fucking time. I know there are people who want to say, well, if Trump does it, it isn't any good. And I despise Trump and what he stands for as much as I believe anybody who might be listening to this podcast. But Obama didn't end our deployment in Afghanistan. And while he nominally pulled most of our troops out of Iraq, he did so after feverish efforts to get the Iraqis to ask us to stay. And ultimately, he executed the Bush exit plan from Iraq. It was not his own. Turning to the immediate concerns here on the West Coast, the wildfires continue to rage largely out of control. Not entirely. The older fires that were caused by lightning almost 3 weeks ago here in California are being contained, and conditions have prevented further spread. But high winds in northeastern California, where just 2 years ago in October, the town of Paradise was burned to the ground, well, there's a fire raging near Lake Oroville. And fortunately, the embattled people of Paradise, many of whom evacuated, are able to return at this point because the fire moved in a different direction. And that's now called the North Complex West Zone, or the Bear Fire. And it's been burning for weeks now, but began spreading rapidly this week due to the strong winds. 2,000 structures have been damaged, and that fire is described as zero contained. Meanwhile, in Central California, east of Fresno, the Creek Fire that started on September 4th in the Sierra National Forest has grown rapidly. That was the scene of the dramatic helicopter evacuations of campers. As of Thursday, the Creek Fire was completely uncontained, had destroyed 361 structures, and mandatory evacuations were put in place in Madera County yesterday. Now, just 25 miles from Los Angeles, in an easterly direction, the Bobcat Fire, which began this past Sunday, that's in the Angeles National Forest, remains fully uncontained. It grew significantly in the last 48 hours, and there has been an evacuation. Now, in Mendocino County, which is north of me here in the San Francisco area, the August complex was initially 37 fires started by that lightning storm on August 17th. Yesterday, it became the largest fire in modern California history, burning 471,000 acres, and it's described as 25% contained. Then, over the border in Oregon, not too far from the California border, the Alameda fire has forced thousands of people to evacuate with little notice. It remains uncontained. The city of Medford was largely evacuated, but crews were able to largely create a perimeter that has protected Medford so far. And then further north in Oregon, east of Eugene, the Holiday Farm fire is zero contained. It's 145,000 acres. It's damaged several communities and forced significant evacuations. And the fires that started a little bit earlier, covering each one is larger than 100,000 acres. And it's variously known as the Beachy Creek Fire, the Santiam Fire, and the Lion's Head Fire. More than 20,000 homes were under mandatory or level 2 evacuation. 5 towns significantly burned. And there are people who are missing. 80-year-old Arthur Dusack lived in a mobile home park. And just like Paradise, some of these towns have names that, stick in your mind. The town of Phoenix has largely been burned out, and we don't know exactly what will arise from the ashes there. Across Oregon, and particularly related to the Alameda fire, at least 50 people remain unaccounted for. And the fires are also continuing in Washington State. The 2 largest are the Cold Springs fire, started on September 6th, grew to 163,000 acres, and the Pearl Hill fire, 174,000, which is described as 41% contained. Now, the death toll has climbed to 10 here in California, and there is serious concern about numerous fatalities in Oregon because it came so quickly and many people had trouble evacuating. And here in the Bay Area, we have a heavy pall in the air. It's a toxic cloud of smog. The ash particulate is not quite as thick as it was yesterday, but the air is putrid. It's over 200 points on that air quality index. One of the things that is plaguing the authorities in Oregon is that on social media, people are spreading ugly rumors. One of them includes what is presumably a right-wing driven rumor that Antifa is ready to pounce as soon as you evacuate your home so that they can loot you. Now, I would argue that Trump supporters are most likely to believe that. But in the last few years, as wildfires have broken out in California, I see armchair experts all across the country go on Facebook and say, oh, yeah, this is obviously a directed energy weapon. And we have a vague idea of what the directed energy weapons are. But people have these rich fantasies. This is what gives conspiracy theories a bad name. And particularly at a point where people need accurate information. It is just downright disgusting to see people promoting various, threads of misinformation. In Oregon, they've also had to evacuate 4 prisons so far. And there's concern about where they can put the prisoners and maintain protocols to try to limit the spread of the coronavirus. Alan McLeod at MintPress dug up an interesting factoid that in the state of Oregon, one of the things that hampers their response to these large and uncontrolled fires that have broken out is that their aircraft, including a number of helicopters, are conveniently located in Afghanistan. The Portland Tribune buried deep in one article information that many of the state's largest firefighting aircraft are deployed in Afghanistan. And this is coupled with the news that a group of Mexican firefighters have been deployed in Oregon. Today I'm releasing a fresh, in-depth interview that I think is important and provocative. I interview co-authors Maya Shenwar and Victoria Law. Their new book is Prison by Any Other Name, subtitled The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms. And Shenwar, who's the editor-in-chief of Truth Out, along with Vicky Law, who is an activist who supports incarcerated women in helping them develop their writing skills. They raise compelling issues about the so-called reforms like home confinement. Did you know that if you sign up for home confinement, that you have to pay for that ankle bracelet that they detain you with? And that the restrictions vary from one jurisdiction to the next, but people end up sent back to prison because they went to one supermarket as they had advised the goons, and it didn't have what they wanted, so they went across the street. And doing that violated the restrictions they face. And in this excerpt, Maya Shenwar talks about how probation and home confinement are widely used and that they have negative, unintended consequences.
Kind of the key distinction that we want to make is that these words, home and community, are just thrown around. Oh, you're not in prison, you're at home, you're in the community. And meanwhile, the home and the community have been prisonized. And you mentioned probation, so it's not just electronic monitoring that does this sort of prisonization of the home and community. Probation is actually the most common alternative to incarceration. There are more than 3.5 million people on probation in this country. So think about that in relation to there being more than 2.2 million people incarcerated. It's well over that in terms of the probation population. And folks who are on probation are put on very, very strict conditions and restrictions that would never apply to people in the larger population. So adults are given curfews, told things like, well, you can't sit in the front seat of a car. That's for you, that's against the law. People are told you can't associate with certain people or places. There are places that you cannot go. Maybe you can't drive a car. So there are all these conditions that are put on people. And then the penalty for that is prison. And probation is actually one of the largest drivers of incarceration, ironically, in addition to being one of the largest alternatives to incarceration.
That's Maya Shenwar. She is co-author with Vicky Law of the new book, Prison by Any Other Name. And it's full of fascinating information about the downside of mandatory drug treatment, about the negative impacts of sexual assault and sexual predator lists, sexual offender lists that people end up on, often for crimes that do not rise to the level of rape, and also the truth about community policing and predictive policing. I think it's a great book, and it should be part of the conversation about police reform and criminal justice reform in this country in the current context. And that interview is available today for my subscribers. They get first crack at it, including Ted Kelly, Ethan Knox, Paul Goodman, and Dick Atlee. And that's because they're subscribers to the Peter B. Collins podcast. And you can do it too. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com/sign up. And the details are right there on the sign-up page. Earlier this week, Judge Dolly G. in Los Angeles, who has long presided over court cases related to the detention of immigrant minors, well, last week she ordered the Trump administration to stop detaining those immigrant kids in hotels before quickly expelling them back to their home countries under pandemic-related border restrictions and, I would add, in violation of American asylum law. Since March, private contractors working for ICE have been detaining hundreds of children who arrive at the border without a parent or guardian in a system of hotels. Now, I don't imagine they allow them access to the minibars, but the children are then quickly sent back to their home countries without being able to access the immigration system. According to court documents, as of July 31st, at least 660 children have been detained in hotels by ICE, and 577 of them were unaccompanied immigrant kids. And Judge Dolly G. in Los Angeles ordered the Department of Homeland Security to stop placing them in hotels no later than September 15th. And her intention is she wants them to be housed with relatives in the United States under the old system, but it's pretty clear that Trumpco will not permit that to happen. We're now learning that the ICE officers who were heavily armed but unidentified when they patrolled the streets outside the White House starting in June of this year and enabling Trump's photo op with the Bible in front of the church there, well, they were flown to Virginia from various locations in Arizona and Florida. And in order to use the official aircraft of the Department of Homeland Security, they couldn't just fly these militarized immigration officers. That would violate the rules. So they put 74 detainees on a flight, or maybe a couple of flights, that ended up in Farmville, Virginia, where a now notorious immigration jail was, they added 74 prisoners as a result of these flights that were mainly just intended to get the armed palace guard into Washington. And we now know that 51 of the 74 individuals who were transferred to Farmville tested positive for the virus, which has led to a wider outbreak there. It shows that these immigrants were treated as disposable objects just in order to comply with rules and allow Trump to import a goon squad to Washington, D.C. In another setback for the Trump administration and the president's order that the census would exclude undocumented immigrants from the count, a federal court, the three-judge panel in Manhattan, that's an appeals court, they said Trump's proposal exceeded his authority under federal law. They said there was no need to consider a second claim in the lawsuit because, well, the merits of the parties' dispute are not particularly close or complicated, the judges wrote. And the judges are right. And by the way, I recently got a letter from the Census Bureau, and on the outside it said, "You have not responded." Well, I did. I sent in our census form in May. And when I read more closely, it was intended for an address that might be located right next to our house. But there is no such address. And that's not a confidence builder. When the Census Bureau, which is supposed to be the central source of data collection in this country, sends a form to a non-existent household. Well, Microsoft is sounding the alarm. The intelligence community is backing them up, and the media is going bonkers. Microsoft says that there have been attempts, let me underscore, there have been attempts that they attribute to Russia and the Cozy Bear operation of the GRU, attempting to hack into the sites of political campaigns. We understand the Biden campaign was a target. Attempting to hack into the private emails of people who are working on those campaigns. And in a front-page article in Friday's New York Times, under the byline of David E. Sanger, the Washington bureau chief and Access journalist, he co-wrote this with Nicole Perloff, they hyped this. And Rachel Maddow did the same thing last night. She had Peter Strzok, the discredited FBI agent, on her show to promote his book, and she let him just go to town, spinning tales of conspiracies involving Russia. And, of course, they sidestepped the debunking of their narrative because the guy at CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, was under oath, and the transcript was released on a delayed basis. But he told Adam Schiff and the Intelligence Committee, you know, Congressman, we don't really have any evidence that Russia removed anything from the DNC. We suspect they got in, but we don't have any evidence that they took anything out. And likewise, in this article at about paragraph 10, it reads, so far, Microsoft officials said they have found no evidence that hacking efforts this year were successful. And then they cite Christopher Krebs, who directs the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security and a former Microsoft employee. None are involved in maintaining or operating voting infrastructure, and there was no identified impact on election systems. So this is a highly speculative piece. And once again, I argue that nobody meddles in American elections like Americans. And if indeed Russia is attempting to do it again, the idea that they can influence the thinking of Americans and get them to change their voting behavior, I think is pretty far-fetched. And there was Maddow with Strzok last night revisiting the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg and claiming that they had poisoned the minds of Americans with a bunch of lame Facebook posts that reached a very, very tiny audience before the 2016 election. And so, once again, we have a media-generated myth that is believed by many Americans. Now, this next one, I have to say, is a little confusing, especially based on what I just said, my skepticism of the whole Russiagate narrative. Because the Trump Treasury Department yesterday announced sanctions against Andriy Durkach, or Durkach. He's a member of the Ukrainian parliament, and you may recall back in May, I played a recording that he had released. It's a heavily doctored phone call between Joe Biden and Petro Poroshenko, the Candyman who was the hand-picked American successor to Yanukovych after we supported his ouster. And you hear in this heavily edited tape Poroshenko telling Joe Biden that, yes, he had fired the prosecutor who he didn't think needed to be fired because Joe was threatening to hold back more than $1 billion in loan guarantees. And I expect that the whole Ukraine story with Burisma and with Biden's bragging about pressuring Ukraine to fire that prosecutor, that story is going to resurface with a vengeance. We have 53 days to the election, so I expect it's going to be in the next couple of weeks. And speaking of Ukraine and Russia and the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, our listener in Ukraine, Amir Krupik, writes in reaction to yesterday's podcast. He says, I want to add some context and fill in some gaps as someone who has lived in Ukraine for the last 6 years. I did find it unusual that Germany came straight out and threw Russia under the bus, so to speak. The reason being gas politics. That has meant Germany usually had a leaning toward Russia, somewhat. The reason I suspect Merkel sort of acted belligerently toward the Ukrainian side in the Normandy discussions. I put this down to the gas politics regarding Nord Stream 2. That's a pipeline that is nearing completion. As former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder of Germany is pals with Putin and works for Gazprom, that's the Russian gas giant. And he links to an NPR story about, it's entitled, Why Putin's Pal, Germany's Ex-Chancellor, Hasn't Landed on a Sanctions List. Anyway, Amir continues, why did Germany say Navalny was definitely poisoned? To just say it to make Putin look bad is kind of silly. At least give us all a why. Maybe it's to make Russia look bad so as to affect Nord Stream 2. Now, who would benefit from this? Maybe Ukraine, as that new pipeline bypasses the old Soviet gas transit system. But also Uncle Sam benefits maybe even more greatly if Nord Stream 2 is put on ice and the EU then has to buy gas from the USA. It's common knowledge that U.S. interests would love an EU gas agreement. Navalny is more beneficial to Ukraine alive as an agitator, so we didn't try to knock him off with our own agents. But maybe Uncle Sam jumped at this opportunity to coax Germany into this type of disinformation. Navalny got sick for whatever reason, and so now CIA or whoever thought they could capitalize on this when he went to Germany for treatment. Thanks, Amir. I appreciate your perspective from Ukraine. Now to Americans meddling in the 2020 election in America. Attorneys for Trump's re-election campaign are urging a federal judge in Las Vegas to block a state law and prevent mail-in ballots from going to all active Nevada voters less than 8 weeks before the election. Trump argues that sending ballots to nearly 1.7 million active voters will impede Republicans' ability to elect candidates because the law will confuse their voters and create incentive to stay away from the polls. Nevada argues that the Trump campaign has failed to explain how it would be harmed. And in Texas, a federal judge has modified the rules for mail-in balloting. Currently, under Texas law, all eligible voters over the age of 65 are allowed to vote by mail. If you're under 65, you can only get a mail-in ballot if you'll be absent from the county on Election Day, are in jail, or have a qualifying disability. And Texas has said that fear of contracting COVID-19 is not an acceptable excuse. So in a 2-1 decision yesterday, the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit sided with Texas. Judge Leslie Southwick wrote for the majority that giving older voters a privilege, the right to vote by mail without having to meet any special conditions, did not hurt the voting rights of voters under 65. But the third judge on the panel, Carl Stewart, dissented, writing that the pandemic did affect whether Texas's vote-by-mail rules violated the 26th Amendment, which states that voting rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. And Stewart wrote in his dissent, Texas law fails to treat members of the electorate equally with regard to mail-in voting. This unequal treatment is discriminatory in normal times and dangerous in the time of a global pandemic. And at the same time, over in Florida, a federal appeals court, this is the 11th Circuit actually sitting in Atlanta, agreed with Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis that ex-felons cannot vote even if they've cleared probation and parole until they've paid off all their fines and fees. And as you may know, it was Florida voters in 2018 who overwhelmingly approved the reinstatement of the right to vote to former felons. And after that passed, the Republican-controlled legislature and DeSantis enacted a law that says, well, you're not considered, cleared and a former felon until you pay off all of your fines and fees. This affects, we're told, hundreds of thousands. of former felons who would have been able to vote in November, but this Jim Crow poll tax, retroactive, has been thrown up as a major roadblock. Britain's Guardian newspaper reports that religious right and social conservative groups are training thousands of volunteers to be deployed in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin to watch for alleged fraud with the expansion of those dastardly mail-in ballots. Texas-based True the Vote, a central player in the right's anti-vote by mail drives, has trained about 10,000 volunteers. Now, I find this ironic because they can go to the local elections office and try to observe the counting, for example, of absentee or mail-in ballots. But because the Republicans think that it's Democrats who want to commit election fraud and voter fraud, they're going to be monitoring the polls where it appears few Democrats will actually appear on Election Day. So I don't see this as an effective or rational strategy. A couple of days ago in my San Francisco Chronicle, it wasn't a full-page ad, but it runs from top to bottom and it's 3 columns wide. And it's written by an elderly couple. One is 83 and the spouse is 78. It doesn't specify who's who in that depiction. But their effort to have a fair election in their twilight years has led them to make 2 recommendations. One is that we should all stop using the mail like 2 weeks before and a week after the election. They say bill payments, birthday cards, and the like should be posted 2 weeks before or after the election. The fate of our democracy may hinge on a handful of first-class letters sent or not sent. And then these elderly people volunteer to sign a liability waiver and report to their local post office to help sort the mail. And they encourage other senior Americans to do the same. The New York Times did some polling analysis, and they show that young voters who were part of the wave that supported Bernie Sanders in the primaries in 2016 and who turned out to help flip the House to Democratic control in 2018, well, the polls show that it's not too clear if those young voters are going to turn out for Joe Biden. His favorability rating is 5 points in the negative among likely voters under the age of 35. That's according to the latest Quinnipiac University poll. Biden leads Trump 63-27 among voters under 35, which is better than Hillary Clinton's 58-28 margin. But will they show up or even mail in a ballot? That remains to be seen. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. And we take a look at the reported numbers today. Worldwide, 28.2 million cases identified. Total deaths is at about 911,000. Here in the U.S., 6.4 million cases, and total deaths reported at 192,000. Most state case counts and deaths, with the exception of Wisconsin, are improving across the nation, but deaths are still more than a third higher than they were at the beginning of July. America has been averaging about 35,000 cases a day, and as I've pointed out, the numbers on fatalities appear to be lower earlier in the week, and then they climb later in the week. Deaths are still more than a third higher than the beginning of July. An American has been dying of COVID-19 every 2 minutes based on the data collected at Johns Hopkins University. Nearly 5,000 Americans have died in the past week. America's been averaging about 35,000 cases a day, and that means about every 3 seconds another American is diagnosed with the coronavirus. Cases are rising again in the European Union, but the U.S. has substantially more cases with substantially less population. And the European Union has been reporting deaths at a fifth of the pace of the United States. The U.S. has about 4.3% of the world's population. 22% of the world's reported cases and 21% of its deaths. California has the dubious distinction, the first state to reach 750,000 identified cases, a third of those in Los Angeles County. In New York, transit commuters will face a $50 fine starting Monday if they refuse to wear a face mask. And in Florida, bars will be allowed to reopen on Monday at 50% capacity. Bloomberg is reporting that Israel is set to enter a second coronavirus lockdown and become the only developed country to shut down again nationwide after a botched reopening sent infections soaring. Daily cases have risen from 5 in late May to more than 4,000 this week. The lockdown is expected to take effect next Wednesday or Friday on the eve of the Jewish holiday season. An inner cabinet of ministers on Thursday approved a 2-week full-fledged lockdown to be followed by 2 more weeks of strict limits on movement and economic activity, and the plan is subject to final approval of the full cabinet this Sunday. There are new statistics from the CDC, and they are breaking down the coronavirus deaths by age group. So, 0.003% of children 18 and younger who are infected with coronavirus ultimately die. The fatality rate for people aged 20 to 49 is 0.02%. It's a half percentage point of people 50 to 69, and it's 5.4% of people 70 or older. Just below 24% of people under the age of 50 who are hospitalized will need intensive care, and that rises to 36% for people 50 to 64 and 35% of people 65 plus. About 2.4% of people ages 18 to 49 who are hospitalized are expected to die. It rises to 10% in the 50 to 64 age group and 26% of people over 65 who are hospitalized. A new study published today by researchers at the State University of New York College, or is that College Park, and ProPublica found that an increase in the concentration of multiple pollutants from a class known as hazardous air pollutants was associated with a 9% increase in COVID-19 mortality. And with the almost chronic dangerous air here on the West Coast that has expanded from California into Oregon and Washington, other states are impacted, but to a lesser degree. And this could be a contributor to a new spike in cases and hospitalizations. Here in the Bay Area, a group of 78 researchers and doctors at the Stanford Medical Center have called out White House coronavirus Dr. Scott Atlas, who used to teach on the campus and is a senior fellow at the conservative Hoover Institution located at Stanford. The letter reads, "Many of his opinions and statements run counter to established science, and by doing so, undermine public health authorities and the credible science that guides effective public health policy." They go on to point out that testing asymptomatic people is important. Children of all ages can be infected with the virus. The letter also casts doubt on so-called herd immunity, noting the safest path to controlling the pandemic is by deploying rigorously evaluated effective vaccines that have been approved by regulatory agencies. It says, encouraging herd immunity through unchecked community transmission is not a safe public health strategy. And Trump continues to pressure universities to open their classrooms and students to enter them. Trump said it's much safer for students to live on campus. Really? Trump said his administration has reviewed data from more than 20 colleges and, quote, not a single student who tested positive for the virus has been hospitalized. But that's bullshit. Just Wednesday, San Diego County public health officials announced that a San Diego State student had been hospitalized, and in Kansas, the Democratic Governor Laura Kelly said in late August that one of the state's college students had been hospitalized. A New York Times survey of more than 1,600 American colleges and universities reveals at least 88,000 cases and at least 60 deaths on college campuses since the pandemic began. Don't tell the White House. It could ruin their hairdo. There is a kerfuffle in Des Moines because Iowa's Republican governor has ordered classrooms to be open for at least 50% of students. But the administrators have refused. So the Des Moines School District, their officials, are openly defying the governor and a judge's order by conducting classes remotely and entirely. The decision puts the district's funding and administrators' jobs at risk, and that is an interesting conflict there. The Food and Drug Administration is telling you, please believe us. In an opinion column published in the credible journal USA Today, 8 directors of the FDA's regulatory centers and offices warned that if the agency's credibility is lost because of real or perceived interference, people will not rely on the agency's safety warnings. And while the letter does not mention Trump, he is the target. Quote, we absolutely understand that the FDA, like other federal executive agencies, operates in a political environment. That is a reality that we must navigate adeptly while maintaining our independence to ensure the best possible outcomes for public health. We and our career staff do the best by public health when we are the decision makers, arriving at those decisions based on our unbiased evaluation of the scientific evidence. And this was cheered by their boss, FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn, who really put the agency's credibility on the line when he appeared with Trump at a White House press event the day before the Republican convention began, and he did not dispute extreme claims about antibodies and plasma that were made by the Orange Monster. And, well, Dr. Hahn is squirming in his swivel chair, trying to hold on to his job and his credibility at the same time, and Trump makes that almost impossible. You may have heard about the island of Lesbos in Greece, where there's a large refugee camp with about 13,000 people who've escaped the conflict in Syria and other places roiled by American adventures. And earlier this week, there was a fire reportedly set by some of the refugees who were fed up with the conditions in this camp. They decided by burning it down that something better might happen. And so far, the Interior Minister of Germany, Horst Seehofer, has agreed to accept 150 unaccompanied minors from the Moria camp. And the European Commission said it would pay for the transfer of up to 400 of the youngsters. And Seehofer, drew criticism for declining to take in more of the nearly 13,000 people who are in need of emergency housing. It's a complex situation, and Greece has taken an increasingly harder line on the refugees, including putting some of them on inflatable boats without motors or oars and just saying, good luck, hope you make it to Turkey. The World Health Organization, which has been attacked by Trump, and it deserves some criticism. I don't think that it is a perfect entity, but it's what we've got. And as you know, Trump has increasingly tried to blame the WHO for blindsiding him about the risk of the spread of the pandemic. Well, based on Bob Woodward's new book, which is all the talk of Washington this week, it's called Rage. We know that Trump admitted back in February that he knew how serious the problem is with coronavirus. This is deadly stuff, he said. It's more deadly than your most strenuous flu. So this NPR report trots out for, quote, public health expert Jeremy Konadijk. And he said, these tapes make clear that the very things that the president was accusing WHO of failing to share, specifically the lethality and transmissibility of this virus, were things that he was already well aware of. And Nancy Cox, who's a former head of the influenza division at CDC, said to blame it on the WHO and then pull out technical and financial support is absurd. One of Trump's best buddies is a guy named Sheldon Adelson, Las Vegas casino owner, big booster of the Zionist extremists in Israel. He's gotten his reward. In a no-bid deal, he is being permitted to buy the former U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. And apparently it's quite a palace. It's on the beach, described as a sprawling compound in the upscale Tel Aviv suburb of Herzliya. And it's $80 million. But Shelley's got the cash. And he's got no competition. There's nobody else bidding on the property. And he has agreed not to take possession until next spring after they boot out the American ambassador and move him to Jerusalem. And, you know, ordinarily this would be a source of outrage and big headlines and Trump crony gets sweetheart deal. But it's just part of the daily corruption of the Trump administration. Alan McLeod at Mint Press points out that in order to support the rogue would-be president of Venezuela, the United States has passed him a bundle of $100 bills, and Juan Guaido and his buddies are passing them out to healthcare workers in Venezuela. And this is part of the ongoing effort for regime change there that is supported by both political parties in this country. And finally today, Rolling Stone has a lengthy investigative report that shows that the workers at oil wells and at fracking sites are exposed to natural radiation at troubling levels. And the story opens with a focus on a middle-aged guy from Ohio who they call Peter, who for $16 an hour drives a tanker truck that takes what they call brine, the wastewater that gushes out of oil and gas wells to the tune of 1 trillion gallons a year across the United States. So he loads it in his truck and he drives it someplace where they inject it back into the earth. But one day, a guy pulled out a Geiger counter at one of his depots and showed him that he was carrying what was described as one of the hottest loads he'd ever seen. So the radioactivity is something that we don't know much about. It's not really disclosed to people. And what we've seen in recent years is that oil drilling sites and fracking sites have been built closer and closer to residential neighborhoods. And here in California, the well-oiled gas lobby was able to kill a bill in Sacramento that would have simply put what they called setbacks in place. And the proposal was that you couldn't build an oil drilling site or a fracking site within 2,500 feet of existing homes. And the bill was watered down to be more of a suggestion than a requirement. And even that died in a committee in the legislature in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast all the way to the end here. I hope you have a great weekend. You'll find this podcast on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. smile.